There are certain smells that stay with you, tucked away deep in the lining of your soul, and no amount of time, no distance, can ever scrub them out. For most folks, a familiar scent is a comfort, a pleasant key that unlocks a sun-drenched memory. The buttery aroma of your grandmother's apple pie, the sharp, clean smell of rain on hot pavement, the metallic sweet tang of a seaside breeze. But for me, the one smell that possesses the power to shatter the decades is something utterly different. It's the intoxicating, heavy perfume of honeysuckle and jasmine, thick and suffocating, mixed with the faint, unsettling scent of cheap aftershave. It's the smell of a summer night from a lifetime ago, the night the old life I knew ceased to exist, only to be replaced by a terrifying new one I was completely unprepared for. That specific aroma, for the rest of the world, speaks of southern warmth, of lazy evenings and front porch swings. But for me, it will forever be the unmistakable, cloying signature of the moment everything I cherished was stolen. My name is Donna, and today I am 78 years old. I live far away now, in a quiet neighborhood up north, where the seasons change with reliable discipline and people value their privacy. It's a steady life, a methodical one, chosen with the fierce determination of a woman who once knew nothing but chaos and a shattering lack of control. Every morning, I water my small collection of potted herbs, and every gesture, every tiny act of tending, is a small, quiet assertion of control over a world that once completely slipped through my grasp. This calm you see now, this hard-won peace that I cultivate along with my flower beds, was not a gift. It was earned in a silent, protracted war. A war fought not on battlefields, but within the confines of a small, whitewashed house in a stiflingly conservative town in the American South back in the 1960s. I was just a girl then, 16 years old, with dreams as fragile and innocent as the wings of a Luna moth. My world was bound by a rigid, ironclad triangle, our simple, well-kept home, the First Baptist Church, with its towering spire and the eyes of the congregation that felt like they were constantly judging you, and the social obligations that governed every single interaction. We lived in the kind of town where appearances weren't just important, they were the very foundation of existence. What the neighbors thought mattered more than the truth. My mother, Barbara, was the anxious shadow of my father, a kind, tireless woman who possessed the incredible ability to stretch the meager cash he gave her into enough groceries for a week and keep the house spotless. But her kindness was a bird in a cage, perpetually stifled by fear. She lived only to anticipate my father's moods, to avoid displeasing him, and to maintain a fragile peace in our home that felt as brittle as dry china. Her communication with me was done through sighs, through fleeting, meaningful glances that spoke volumes her lips would never dare to utter. When I was little and scraped my knee, it was her terrified gaze that hurt more than the wound itself. It was a look that didn't say, "I'll kiss it better," but rather, "Please don't cry out loud, don't upset your father." And so, I quickly learned the art of swallowing my tears, of converting my sobs into a tight, hard knot right behind my breastbone. Sometimes, late at night, I could hear her humming an old, quiet hymn from her youth while mending clothes. But the instant my father, Robert, stepped into the room, the song would break off abruptly, leaving behind a silence that was even heavier than the melody. My father was a man cut from the same uncompromising cloth as the strict morality of our town. Hard, unyielding on the surface, and intensely quiet. His hands, gnarled and perpetually split from his work managing a local lumber yard, could drive a point home with terrifying precision, but they couldn't seem to manage the simple, comforting gesture of a pat or a hug. His affection was a mute language, measured out in the roof. He kept solid above our heads and the certainty that we would never go without the essentials. Words, Especially words of love or softness were frivolous luxuries that belonged in the romance novels I occasionally managed to sneak, not in real life. His gospel, his one and only unshakable belief, was summed up in a single, devastating word: honor. The family's honor was an invisible but monstrous altar upon which everything else had to be sacrificed. And I understood very early on that the family's honor resided almost entirely in my conduct. A skirt considered too short, a lingering glance at a boy during the Sunday walk, a laugh in public that was judged too loud. Every single thing was a potential, irreparable stain on the reputation that was supposed to be as pristine and white as a preacher's collar. I remember once, I must have been about 12. The daughter of the family 2 streets over, a girl not much older than I was seen chatting alone with a boy behind the gas station after school. They did nothing, they were only talking, exchanging books, I think, but it was enough. I watched her father physically drag her home by the arm. For weeks, that girl wasn't seen outside the house. And when she finally reappeared to attend church, she walked with her eyes constantly downcast, as if she were carrying an immense, invisible burden on her shoulders. The women of the town simply stopped greeting her. That cruel, silent lesson was burned into my young mind. A woman's mistake was never hers alone. It became the crushing shame of the entire family. It was a fear, a pervasive social contract that dictated my every move. And then there was Dennis, my cousin. He was a few years older than me, the son of my father's brother, making him part of the inescapable landscape of our daily lives, as inevitable as the summer heat or the damp chill of winter. He was always around, always present at family gatherings, and felt completely entitled to walk right into our house without knocking. While other boys in town would give me shy, curious, or even gentle glances, Dennis's gaze was different. It was heavy, insistent, and seemed to demand permission to rest upon me. His eyes didn't ask, they took. They made me feel examined, assessed, like livestock at a county fair. His brazenness always put me intensely on edge. He carried himself with the confidence of a young man who believed he had the right to do and say whatever he pleased, protected both by his gender in a world ruled by men and by the fact that his father's carpentry business was doing better than my father's lumber yard. In our town, prosperity spoke louder than kindness. A few months before the town's annual festival, I was walking home from the local grocery store, carrying a heavy basket of canned goods and milk. He rounded the corner of the general store and blocked my path. "Where are you hurrying off to, little cousin?" he asked, with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. I tried to walk around him, but he shifted, effortlessly blocking me again. "You've grown up into quite the lady, haven't you?" he remarked, and reached out a hand to touch my hair, which I had carefully pinned up for the heat. I instinctively recoiled, a movement so sharp that I nearly dropped the heavy basket. He laughed. "Can't a guy even give a compliment?" he said, in a mock-offended tone. Just then, the wife of the local school principal walked by, saw us, and smiled widely. "What sweet children," she said kindly. "You two make such a nice pair." I felt a cold dread instantly flood my veins, but Dennis preened, basking in the public approval, and thanked her. That small incident left a residue of deep disquiet that lingered for days. I tried to avoid him, to make myself utterly invisible whenever he was nearby. But it was useless. It seemed that my aversion only amused him, challenging him like a matador to a bull. That summer, the town's biggest event was the annual Founders' Day Festival. It was the single most anticipated social event of the year. The main street would be strung with elaborate arches of colored lights that, at night, transformed our humble town square into a magical, shimmering place. Vendors sold sticky funnel cake and tin toys, and a slightly out-of-tune band would play right up until midnight. For us young people, it was one of the only accepted occasions to be outside after dark, a precious gasp of air in a life that often felt like one long, anxious holding of breath. My mother, in a rare act of extravagance, had bought a bolt of pale blue cotton fabric and sewn me a new dress. The evening of the festival, as I was trying it on, my father walked into the bedroom. He looked me up and down for a long moment, in silence. "Isn't the neckline too low?" he asked, his voice a grim pronouncement. My mother rushed to answer for me. "No, Robert, it's quite modest, look." And she quickly tugged the collar up closer to my throat, almost suffocating me. I looked at my reflection in the cracked vanity mirror in our bedroom, and for a fleeting moment, despite everything, I didn't see Robert's carefully monitored daughter. I saw Donna. A girl with a desperate, aching longing for lightness in her heart. That evening, the air was heavy, humid, and smelled richly of frying batter, spun sugar, and the sulfur from the fireworks that were slated for later. The town square was a pulsing river of people, a low, constant murmur of voices, laughter, and music. I even managed to exchange a few words with my girlfriends, laughing freely and openly, feeling for a moment wonderfully normal, almost free. My father watched us from a distance, seated at the diner's counter with the other important men of the town, a silent warden whose presence I could feel keenly, even with my back to him. My mother sat beside him, rigidly still, her smile a thin, strained line, her eyes never letting me out of sight. It was during the fireworks display that everything changed. The band fell silent, and people flocked together, their faces tilted toward the sky, a single body collectively holding its breath, completely lost in the brilliant bursts of color that tore through the blackness. I was mesmerized, completely captivated by the spectacle that felt like a powerful rebellion against the night. In that festive chaos, in that moment of collective distraction, I lost sight of my parents. I wasn't overly worried. Everyone was right there, in the square that, for one night, seemed to be the vibrant center of the world. When the last firework burst in a glittering golden cascade and the flickering archlights came back on, the crowd began to slowly dissolve like snow in the sun. I saw my friends wave goodbye and drift away with their families. I turned to look for mine, scanning the faces, but they weren't there. A small seed of cold panic began to sprout in my chest. "Lost your way, little cousin?" Dennis's voice, right behind me, made me jump so violently I almost cried out. He had appeared from nowhere, silent as a shadow. His smile was a grimace that promised nothing good. "No," I replied, trying to infuse my voice with a confidence I didn't feel. "I'm looking for my parents." "Oh," he said with an exaggerated carelessness. "I saw them just a minute ago." They left with my dad. They had to urgently discuss something about the lumber yard, a problem with the delivery. They told me to tell you to just head on home, that it was getting late. I hesitated. The explanation was entirely plausible. Business problems, especially those involving money or the lumber yard, were always urgent matters for my father. But it felt fundamentally strange. My father would never, ever leave me alone like that. He would have sent for me, he would have waited, or at the very least, he would have made sure my mother gave me explicit instructions. But Dennis spoke with such easy certainty, such naturalness. Perhaps I was worrying for absolutely nothing. "Come on, I'll walk you home," he said, stepping closer to me. "You don't want to be walking home all alone at this hour, do you? Think about what folks would say if they saw you." He used the magic words, the invisible chains. Think about what folks would say. That was the phrase that governed our every breath, the unwritten rule of our society. I nodded, reluctantly, feeling stupid for having doubted him at all. We started walking, leaving the thick, comforting noise of the emptying square. Instead of taking the main road, the one still lit by the strings of electric bulbs and the lights from the houses, Dennis abruptly turned into a dark, narrow alleyway. "It's a shortcut this way," he said, without even looking at me. My heart, which had just begun to calm down, immediately started pounding again, an insane drum in the overwhelming silence. The sounds of the festival faded quickly, replaced by the sinister echo of our footsteps on the cracked concrete. The alley was tight, oppressive, flanked by high blank walls that seemed to close in on us. I knew that at the end of the alley, it opened onto a small, deserted lot behind the church, a place where children weren't allowed to play because of the overgrown weeds and the smell of stale, damp earth. The air suddenly felt cold, and the sweet smell of the cotton candy was completely wiped out by the cloying, heavy scent of honeysuckle and jasmine vines that grew wild, strong, and almost suffocatingly dense right there in the darkness. "Dennis, this isn't the right way," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Let's go back to the main street." He didn't respond. He just kept walking, as if he hadn't heard me at all. I stopped dead in my tracks. My legs refused to take another step in that direction. "I'm going back." I turned around to leave, but he was faster. With a single quick motion, he was back in front of me, completely blocking the narrow exit. His smile was entirely gone. In its place was an expression I had never seen before, a terrifying mix of raw desire and pure contempt that sent a bolt of ice through my veins. "Where do you think you're going?" he said, his voice low, unrecognizable, almost a snarl. "You always do this, don't you? Playing the little innocent. You think you're better than everyone else, with those fancy books you read and your quiet ways. But you looked at me tonight. I saw you. You're just like all the rest of them." I stumbled backward, my spine hitting the cold, rough surface of the cinder block wall. I was completely trapped. "That's not true. Let me pass, Dennis. Please." "Please?" He laughed, a short, ugly, dry sound that echoed unnervingly in the alley. "Now you say, please. It's a little late for pleases." He moved in closer, invading my space, suffocating me, removing my air, my world. I could hear his heavy, uneven breathing and smell the stale beer on his breath. The sound of the band, which had started playing a cheerful polka again in the distant town square, now reached me faint and distorted, as if it were coming from a different world, a happy, unaware world to which I no longer belonged. I raised my hands, a useless, instinctive gesture to try and hold him away. He grabbed them both with a powerful, brutal force I didn't know he possessed, crushing my wrists against the rough stone wall. "Let go," I whispered again. But my voice was a thin, useless thread, a plea that was instantly swallowed by the darkness, broken by the sheer terror and the devastating, heavy realization of what was about to happen. His face was inches from mine. The entire world constricted to that dark alley, that heavy, sickening smell of jasmine and honeysuckle, to his eyes glaring at me in the gloom. The final firework, a solitary, delayed burst, exploded high in the black sky. I saw the colored light flash, reflected in his eyes for one single terrifying instant. Then, the darkness became absolute, and the sound of the festival finally vanished entirely, swallowed up by a silence that would scream inside me for the rest of my life. The silence that followed was not empty. It was a dense, heavy silence, thick with unspoken words, with screams that were stuck in my throat, lodged tight behind the knot of tears I had suppressed since childhood. I can't say how long I stood there, my back pressed against the gritty wall, in that suffocating alley, saturated with the scent of jasmine that had become the stench of my crushing humiliation. Minutes? An hour? Time had lost all meaning. My body felt like a cold, aching stranger, an empty shell that no longer belonged to me. I could feel the searing pain on my wrists, where his brutal grip had left its mark, but it was a distant sensation, as if it were happening to someone else whom I was observing from a great distance. My soul had retreated into a remote, safe corner of myself, leaving only a hollow exterior to suffer the world. At some point, my legs began to move with a mechanical will of their own. One step, then another, an automaton that knew the path to the house. I walked through the now deserted streets. The colored string lights, which only moments before had seemed so magical and inviting, now hung like grotesque, mocking skeletons, a colorful jeer at my deep interior darkness. Every lighted window was a fresh stab of pain. Behind those panes, I imagined families, fathers reading the evening paper, mothers tucking their children into bed, girls my age sleeping safe in their beds, protected, blissfully unaware. The word home echoed hollowly in my head, but it had completely lost its meaning. It was no longer a refuge. It was only the inevitable destination of my new, raw shame. When I opened the front door, the hinge's slight creak sounded like a sharp accusation. I found my mother waiting for me. She was sitting at the kitchen table in the dim light, illuminated only by the flickering flame of a single votive candle set before a small, framed image of Jesus. She hadn't changed yet. She was still wearing her dress from the festival. Her body was motionless, but I could feel her intense anxiety in the air, thick and heavy like smoke. "Donna, where in God's name have you been? Praise the Lord. Your father is absolutely furious. He went out looking for you again. We called your friends everywhere," she whispered, her voice a sharp hiss, charged with a panic that felt more like self-preservation than concern for me. I couldn't answer. I couldn't. Words were nothing but rubble at the bottom of my throat. I approached the table, every step an agony, and sat down across from her. I desperately wanted to speak. I wanted to scream, to cry, to vomit all the sheer horror. But I was mute. So I just looked at her, concentrating all my overwhelming despair into my eyes, hoping they could somehow speak for me. I hoped she could see past my rumpled dress, past my disheveled hair, past my graveyard silence. That she could see the gaping, jagged crack that had opened in the heart of her child, a chasm that had swallowed me whole. She scrutinized me, her gaze a sharp blade that passed from my face to my wrists, which I instinctively tried to hide beneath the table. I saw a flicker of understanding, a momentary comprehension, flash across her eyes. And instantly following it, a wave of pure, chilling terror. But it wasn't terror for me. It wasn't a mother's anguish for her daughter's pain. It was a selfish terror for herself, for the family, for the impending scandal, for the vicious tongues of the town gossips. Her face, which a moment before had been taut with waiting, hardened into an impenetrable mask of stone. She sprang up from the chair, which scraped harshly against the linoleum floor, as if my mere proximity might contaminate her. "What have you done?" she whispered, and in those 3 words, in that "you," there was already all the guilt, all the blame, all the accusation. Not, "What happened to you?" but, "What have you done?" I shook my head, slowly. The first tears finally began to streak my face, hot and bitterly silent. They were desperate, quiet tears. I looked for her eyes again, a final mute plea. "Mother, help me. Tell me what to do. Hug me. Please, hug me." But she did something that was worse than a slap, worse than an angry scream. She deliberately averted her gaze. She turned her back completely on me and began arranging the coffee cups on the cupboard shelf that were already perfectly in order. Her hands, which I could see were trembling slightly, moved with mechanical, senseless urgency. Her back was a solid wall, a wall erected between me and her, between my excruciating pain and her paralyzing fear. The silence stretched, tightening until it became a loud, painful buzz in my ears. Then her voice came, cold, sharp as broken glass, every word deliberately chosen to wound, to seal my fate. "You will be quiet." I remained still, my breath utterly trapped in my throat. "Did you hear me?" she continued, never turning around. Her voice was a low, fiercely controlled hiss. "You will be quiet. You will not tell a soul. No one. What happened, whatever it was, it did not happen tonight." It was a bad dream. Tomorrow morning, you will wake up and it will all be as it was before. Think of your father. Think of the family. Think of the honor your father works so hard to protect. If you speak, if just one word leaves your mouth, you will destroy all of us. You will bury us alive in shame. Every word was a nail driven deep into my heart. It was not a request. It was a brutal command, a death sentence for my truth. In that precise moment, I understood that I was truly, completely, irrevocably alone. The first and most crushing violence had not been suffered in that dark alley. I had suffered it right there, in my own kitchen, from the lips of my own mother. He had broken my body. She, with those quiet, terrifying words, had utterly shattered my soul. I nodded in the darkness, an imperceptible gesture that she couldn't possibly see. I stood up, the chair making no sound as I moved it back. Without speaking a single word, I walked past her, a ghost brushing by a wall, and went into my small bedroom, closing the door softly behind me. I didn't cry anymore. My tears had frozen inside me, transforming into a block of hard, cold ice in my chest. That night, and the nights that followed, I did not sleep. I lay in bed, my eyes wide open in the darkness, reliving every single second, every word, every silence. The cloying, heavy scent of jasmine seemed to have impregnated the sheets, the pillow, the very air inside of me. The subsequent days were an unreal gray limbo. I moved through the house like a haunting shadow. I performed my chores, washing the laundry, scrubbing the floors, preparing the meals, with a mechanical precision, while my mind was elsewhere, perpetually trapped in that dark alley. My mother didn't speak to me except for sharp, low orders, and when she did, she used a tone that was completely neutral, impersonal. She never, ever met my gaze. My father, who had returned home that night and was eventually placated by the fact that I had reappeared, remained completely ignorant of the truth. He merely complained that I had become strange and uselessly quiet. The tension in the house was palpable, a poisonous fog that seeped into every crack, making the air suffocating. I lived in constant, gnawing terror of running into Dennis. If I heard footsteps approaching our front door, my heart would stop instantly. Every time I had to leave the house to get bread or run an errand, I felt exposed, naked. And the town, my small, familiar town, had become an open-air prison. A secret like mine, in a place where the walls had ears and glances, where court verdicts could not remain buried for long. The whispers started. I don't know how exactly. Maybe someone saw something. Maybe Dennis's lie about my parents having left was too transparent. The rumors began to slither through the town like small, venomous snakes. I felt it in the way the silence would fall abruptly when I walked into the general store. I saw it in the eyes of the women at the church bake sale, oblique glances, loaded with a morbid curiosity and thinly veiled contempt. One afternoon, the school principal's wife, the same woman who had been so kind to me, served me my pound of coffee without looking me in the face, and she didn't ask, as she always did, how my mother was faring. That cold silence was far more eloquent than 1,000 insults. The confirmation that the poison had hit its target came one evening, about a week after the festival. We were at dinner. The silence was broken only by the clink of silverware on our plates. Suddenly, my father violently slammed his fork onto the table with a sharp clang that made both my mother and me jump. Today at the diner, the men asked me why my daughter is walking around with a funeral face, he said, his voice dangerously low and threatening. They asked me if there was some kind of trouble brewing, if maybe we needed to prepare for a wedding. My mother visibly paled. I felt the blood drain completely from my face. My hands instantly went ice cold. "It's just idle gossip, Robert," my mother murmured, her voice a thin thread. "People have nothing better to do than talk." My father turned slowly toward me. For the first time in days, He looked me straight in the eyes. His gaze was not that of a concerned father. It was cold, utterly merciless, and intensely investigative. It was the look of a judge who had already decided on the sentence. "Is there something you need to tell me, Donna?" he asked, his voice deceptively calm. But it was a terrible calmness, the stillness before a massive storm, the calm of a hunter who has backed his prey into a corner. I shook my head, incapable of speaking. My mother's words, "You will be quiet, do not say a word," were my only shield, my inescapable prison. I opened my mouth, but only a strangled sound emerged, a small, pathetic whimper. He continued to stare at me, and in the agonizing silence that followed, I read his terrifying conviction. He didn't need my confession. The whispers of the town, the notion of the family's stained honor, were already his cold, hard truth. He stood up from the table, his chair scraping loudly on the linoleum. "I will talk to my brother tomorrow," he said, and those words sounded like a death sentence pronounced in the middle of our dinner. He walked out of the house, slamming the door with a violence that rattled the window panes. That night, curled up in my bed, I heard the voices of the men in the kitchen, my father, my uncle, Dennis's father. And then I heard his voice, Dennis's voice. He was there, in my house. A wave of sick nausea washed over me. Their voices were low, angry, an indistinct murmur from which the words dishonor and reparation occasionally surfaced. After what felt like an eternity, I heard the front door close again, and then a tomb-like silence, heavier than any scream. The next morning, no one spoke a word. The air was unbreathable. My father didn't go to the lumber yard. He remained seated in the kitchen, staring at an indeterminate spot on the wall for hours. I stayed locked in my small room, knowing that my fate was being sealed without me. At noon, my father called me. His voice was utterly devoid of inflection. "Donna, come in here." I walked into the kitchen like a lamb being led to slaughter. He was still sitting at the table. My mother stood by the stove, her back to me, intently polishing a pot that was already spotless. He motioned for me to sit down across from him. I obeyed. He looked at me for a long time, with a gaze I couldn't decipher. There was no anger, no sadness. There was only a cold, terrifying resignation. As if I were no longer his daughter, but a problem that needed to be surgically resolved, a damage that needed to be surgically repaired. "The family," he began, his voice flat and monotone. "It is the most important thing. A clean name is a far more precious inheritance than any amount of land. When a family's name is smeared, it must be cleansed, at any cost." He paused. "What has happened, has happened. The fault no longer matters. Only the solution matters. There is only one way to set things right. Only one way to stop the rumors, to cover the shame." I knew what he was about to say. I felt it in my gut, a cold terror that paralyzed me entirely. "I have spoken with my brother. We have decided. You will marry Dennis next week." The world stopped spinning. For a moment, the air solidified in my lungs. "No," I whispered. "Father, please, no." "It is not a request," he said, his tone hardening instantly. "It is a decision. It is the only possible decision. He has dishonored our blood, and he will pay for it by taking his responsibility. You will do your duty and save this family's honor. You will become his wife, and this matter will end here. No one will dare to speak of it again." "But I don't want to." My voice broke into a desperate, wretched sob. I hate him. I can't. Please, Father, I beg you, anything but this." For the first time in my life, I raised my voice directly against him. My eyes frantically darted toward my mother, searching for any hint of help, an ally. She was still there, utterly motionless, her back to me. She hadn't moved an inch. Her silence was her complete approval, her stillness, her damning complicity. My father slammed his fist onto the table with such force that my plate jumped. "Enough!" he thundered, his voice filling the room and instantly silencing me. "Your will does not matter. Do you understand? You lost the right to want anything the night you stained our name. Now you will only do what you are told. Prepare yourself. The matter is closed." He stood up and stormed out of the room. The matter is closed. My life was closed. I remained there, sitting, staring at the empty chair across from me. I had been tried and condemned without appeal. My captor would become my husband, and my prison would become my home. And my judges, the very people who were supposed to protect me, had just handed my jailer the keys to my cell. My mother finally moved, but she didn't turn toward me. Slowly, without making a sound, she walked out of the kitchen, leaving me completely alone with my crushing sentence. When my mother walked out of that kitchen, leaving me alone with my father's empty chair, a new kind of silence settled over me. It wasn't the tense quiet of waiting anymore. It was the hollow, absolute silence of an ending. I felt like a condemned prisoner right after the verdict was read. The time separating me from execution was no longer a life, but merely a countdown, a slowly fading echo. The few days that followed, the handful of hours standing between me and the forced wedding, I lived as if I were wrapped in a thick layer of heavy cotton wool. The sounds of the world reached me muffled, and the movements of the people around me were slow, blurred, like a nightmarish dream from which I simply couldn't wake up. I no longer existed as a person. I had been downgraded to an object, the central piece in a somber, hurried ritual that everyone around me was desperate to complete to scrub away a stain. And the stain, in their eyes, was me. The word wedding was only ever spoken in hushed, low tones, laced with a toxic mix of shame and necessity. There were no joyous announcements, no excited visits from relatives offering congratulations. There was only a feverish, silent activity, a hurried movement of hands, and things that completely excluded me from the process. My mother, Barbara, immediately set about preparing my hope chest. I would watch her pull out the fine, hand-embroidered linens from their cedar chests, the hand-woven tablecloths, the crocheted towels. Every single piece had been sewn and lovingly preserved, waiting for a day of celebration, for a happy union that would properly honor the family. Now, her hands moved with a mechanical, almost angry speed, as if she were desperate to rid herself of those profaned dreams as quickly as possible. One afternoon, I found her folding a tablecloth, with tears streaming silently down her face. But the instant she became aware of my presence, she quickly dried her face with a sharp, harsh gesture, and her expression immediately returned to its impenetrable, stone-cold mask. The brief, raw moment of shared sorrow was over, replaced by the wall she had built between us. A couple of days later, a seamstress from a neighboring town arrived at the house. An older woman with a severe face whom we didn't know. She had been specifically hired so she wouldn't ask too many probing questions. She took my measurements in an arctic silence, her movements abrupt and impersonal, treating me like an inanimate mannequin. My mother had given her her own simple wedding dress to alter to fit me. It was a modest dress, made of a heavy, pale fabric, yellowed by time and careful storage. As the seamstress was carefully pinning the cold fabric onto me, I caught my reflection in the old, cracked vanity mirror in my room. I didn't see a bride. I saw a prisoner being carefully sewn into her uniform. I saw a pale girl with hollow eyes, two dark, vacant pools that I didn't recognize as my own. In that instant, I felt a surge of violent self-repulsion so intense that I had to grab onto a nearby chair to steady myself. I absolutely despised the reflected image, her passivity, her total surrender, her defeat. I tore my eyes away and made a silent vow to myself I would never look at myself in a mirror again. For that entire agonizing week, I never saw Dennis, and it was a small, terrible consolation. His absence was almost worse than his presence, because it left a gaping void that my imagination filled with the most terrifying scenarios of the life that was relentlessly waiting for me. I knew that he, too, had been forced into this. But his was the coercion of a man forced to pay a penalty for a crime he had committed and enjoyed. Mine was the unbearable coercion of a victim forced to live forever on the actual scene of that very crime. In the perverse, broken logic of our world, he, the man, would ultimately be seen as the winner, or at least the one who fulfilled his obligation. He would have a wife, a home, a respectable life. I, on the other hand, would be his living punishment, the constant, excruciating reminder of his guilt and at the same time, the perpetual, silent victim of it. The wedding day arrived with the chilling predictability of a sudden illness, relentless, bringing with it a low, heavy gray sky, even though it was the height of summer. My mother helped me dress in a tomb-like silence. Her gestures were those of someone preparing a body for burial. Not a single word of comfort, not a single gentle caress. Only cold, quick fingers that buttoned, adjusted, and tightened the dress. When my father, Robert, walked into the room to take me to the church, he looked me over from head to toe and nodded curtly, with the same expression of grim satisfaction he wore when contemplating a neatly plowed field after a long, hard day's work. He had repaired the damage. Honor was saved. The price of that repair, my entire ruined existence, was a mere negligible detail, an invoice already quietly paid in full. The walk to the church felt like the longest journey of my life. The few people we passed stopped to stare, but no one smiled. I saw a potent mix of pity, disdain, and morbid curiosity in their eyes. I was a spectacle. The disgraced girl who was now being saved. In the church, I found Dennis waiting for me at the altar. I refused to look at him. I kept my eyes fixed rigidly on the cracks in the stone floor, counting my shallow breaths to stop myself from fainting entirely. I could feel his gaze burning into me, but I steadfastly refused to return it. The minister, an elderly man whose voice sounded as tired and worn as the ancient stones of that church, began the ceremony. His words about love, about fidelity, about devotion, about sacred union echoed in my ears like unholy blasphemies screamed in a holy place. Every word was a crushing lie, an insult to the terrifying truth of my reality. When the moment came for me to say, my I do, the word absolutely refused to leave my throat. It stuck there, a hard lump of final, desperate rebellion, the last gasp of the old Donna. I felt my father's hand clamp down on my arm like a vice, a silent, painful warning. I closed my eyes, and the word finally emerged, a soulless whisper, the sound of my final, absolute surrender. After the ceremony, there was no reception. Just a grim, strained lunch at my in-laws' home, attended only by the immediate family. The air was so thick with tension, you could have cut it with a knife. They talked about the weather, about the upcoming harvest, about a strange illness that had struck a neighbor's sheep. They talked about absolutely everything except us. I didn't touch the food. I sat rigidly, wishing only to become instantly invisible. Then the moment arrived. Go on. This is your home now, my new father-in-law said, his tone neither kind nor cruel, only coldly factual. Dennis's house was a short walk away. As I walked beside him, for the first time as his wife, I felt as though I were walking to the gallows. He opened the door and curtly gestured for me to go inside. I stepped over the threshold. The house was small, impersonally clean, but cold, odorless, utterly anonymous. It was a house with no history, and I instantly knew it would never become mine. He closed the door firmly behind me. The dry, sharp sound of the deadbolt clicking into place was the most terrible sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a prison door slamming shut forever. The early days of my new life were a hell of unrelenting silence and slow, calculated contempt. Dennis's cruelty wasn't delivered in loud screams or physical beatings. It was subtler, more deeply psychological, and because of that, perhaps, even more devastating. It was a slow, daily erosion of my very soul. In the mornings, he would get up and go to his work at the carpentry shop without a single word. In the evenings, he would return, eat the dinner I had prepared in a heavy silence, and then sit down to read the paper or smoke on the front porch, ignoring my presence completely. It was as if I weren't a person at all, but merely a part of the house's furniture. His abuse was primarily verbal, metered out with precise cruelty to constantly humiliate and diminish me. "You ought to be thanking me every day," he told me once, his eyes cold and hard. "Without me, you'd be the laughingstock of this county right now, a dirty name whispered behind every curtain. If he caught me with a book in my hands, still reading that silly nonsense? Focus on mending my shirts instead of filling your head with smoke. Look where your high and mighty attitude got you." He quickly isolated me from the world. I wasn't allowed to go out except to shop for groceries or attend church, and even then, I had to return immediately. He would time me. Slowly, the few people who had dared to show compassion stopped talking to me. I had become Dennis's wife, a figure to be pitied and, most importantly, to be avoided. Money was yet another brutal instrument of control. He gave me a meager, stingy sum for groceries, and he demanded a precise accounting of every single penny spent. Night was the absolute worst time. There was no gentleness, no affection whatsoever. There was only the brutal assertion of his right over me, a conjugal duty that I endured in silent, utter detachment, my soul traveling miles away. I quickly learned to effectively separate my mind from my body. While he was over me, I would travel far away in my head, thinking about the vast ocean, the adventurous books I had read, an independent life I would now never have. It was during this dark period that my private vow became a rigid, ironclad habit. I stopped looking into mirrors entirely. There was a small one in the bathroom, above the sink. Every morning, I would wash my face while keeping my eyes fixed low, staring only at the running water. The image it reflected was not me. It was the hollow ghost of Donna. I absolutely hated that woman. Her weakness, her quiet resignation. Looking at her was like staring directly into my complete failure. And so, I chose never to look again. I lived in a house without mirrors because the most painful reflection was the one I carried deep inside myself. The months crawled by, slow, gray, and indistinguishable from one another. I had fallen into a deep apathy, a heavy fog that both dulled the pain and extinguished every other emotion. I was merely surviving. I breathed, I ate, I slept, I cleaned. But I wasn't living. Then, one day, something changed. I started to feel strangely unwell in the mornings. A persistent, sick nausea, a profound and heavy fatigue. At first, I vehemently denied it to myself. But when my monthly cycle was missed for the second time, I understood with a jolt of cold clarity. A chilling, deep terror instantly seized me. I was pregnant. My first reaction was one of pure, raw despair. A child of Dennis. Another bond, the strongest, most unbreakable one, tying me to my captor. I felt even more horribly trapped than before. For days, I lived with this terrible secret, my throat perpetually tight. How could I ever love a creature born from so much raw pain? One evening, I was sitting alone in the kitchen, in the near darkness. Dennis was out at the local tavern. I was completely lost in my dark thoughts when, suddenly, I felt a small, almost imperceptible movement deep inside me. A flutter. A tiny bubble of life shifting in the darkness of my body. I froze, holding my breath. And then I felt it again. more distinct. A small tap, a greeting from an unknown world. In that very moment, a miracle happened. All the fog, all the paralyzing terror seemed to instantly dissolve, giving way to a new, utterly unknown emotion, so powerful it took my breath away. It was not Dennis's child. It was my child. It was a life, an innocent life that depended entirely, absolutely on me. A small, tenacious light that had somehow been lit in the deepest, darkest void. I instinctively placed my hands over my belly, a powerful, protective gesture that wasn't reasoned but came from a deep, long-forgotten part of myself. And for the first time in what felt like an infinite amount of time, I wept. But they were not the bitter, silent tears of despair. They were different tears, warm, intensely liberating. I cried for the girl I had been, for the woman I had become. But above all, I cried with an overwhelming gratitude for that tiny life growing inside me against all logic, against all hope. In that cold, unloving house, I had found a reason not to die inside. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't know how I would manage. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I would no longer be completely alone. I had someone to fiercely protect, and to protect him, I would have to find a way, sooner or later, to protect myself. That tiny life hadn't saved me yet, but it had given me an undeniable reason to start fighting. The discovery of that small life within me wasn't the magical key that instantly unlocked the door of my prison. It was, instead, like finding a single, precious seed in a vast, desolate desert of stone. It didn't promise an oasis, not yet, but it contained within it the miraculous, stubborn possibility of a root, of something concrete to cling to so I wouldn't be entirely swept away by the chilling wind of desperation. That creature became my secret, sacred center, the fixed point in an existence that would have otherwise dissolved into the meaningless grayness. My life had stopped being an anxious wait for the end. It had become the eager anticipation of a beginning. The pregnancy progressed in an atmosphere of near-total silence, a private, mute conversation between me and my changing body. Dennis, after I delivered the news with 3 clipped words one evening at dinner, "I'm having a baby," received the information with a grunt that was meant in his mind as approval. For him, a child wasn't a joy to be shared, but a biological duty completed, public proof of his virility and the guarantee of an heir for his carpentry business and his family name. It was a point scored in his favor in the eternal game of life. He never once asked me, "How are you feeling?" He never touched my belly with a gesture of curiosity or affection. My pregnancy was an event happening in my body, a body he considered his, but which interested him only for the final result. Paradoxically, his chilling indifference was an unexpected gift. It allowed me to live that waiting period in a sacred, inviolable space that felt entirely mine. That child was mine, not ours. He was the fruit of a bitter duty, but the deep love that grew within me for him was the only thing I truly possessed that was completely free. The day of the delivery arrived with the violent abruptness of a late summer thunderstorm. I was assisted by the town midwife, an elderly woman with rough hands and eyes that had seen everything, and by my mother-in-law, whose presence felt more like an act of sterile supervision than genuine comfort. It was a brutal, primal experience, an ocean of relentless pain in which I thought I would surely drown multiple times. Each contraction left me breathless. Each pause was only the terrifying anticipation of the next crushing wave. In those raw hours, I was no longer Donna. I was only a body fighting, an animal struggling to bring forth its young. But when, finally, after a time that felt eternal, I heard the first powerful wail that filled the small room, tearing through the tense silence, all the pain in the world seemed to instantly vanish, erased by that miraculous sound. The midwife placed a small, screaming bundle in my arms. It was a boy. I looked at him, his small, red, wrinkled face, his perfect little hands waving in the air, and I felt a wave of love so fierce, so absolutely unconditional and all-consuming that it left me breathless. It was the first, real, pure emotion I had felt in years. I clutched him tightly to me, and in that contact, in that warm scent of new life, I rediscovered a part of myself that I had believed was dead and buried forever. Dennis decided we would name him Thomas. It was the name of his grandfather, a stern, supposedly righteous man. I didn't object. Names didn't matter to me. Only that small, helpless creature mattered. Thomas instantly became my universe. His needs structured my days, which before had been a gray, timeless expanse. His cries in the dead of night, his toothless smiles, the way his tiny fingers would grip my pinky with surprising strength, they were the only real music in an otherwise mute house. Together, we created a secret world, an invisible bubble that Dennis, with his coarse, blunt sensibility, could neither see nor penetrate. When he was out at the carpentry shop, I would talk to Thomas, not with the silly, high-pitched voices people use with infants, but with my real voice. I would tell him the stories I had read in my hidden books, those tales of distant worlds, of brave knights and courageous women who chose their own destinies. I described the far-off mountains to him, even though I had only ever seen them on blurry postcards. I sang for him, in a very low voice, the lullabies my mother had sung for me, and in doing so, I felt a slight crack appear in the thick wall of anger I had built against her, a small opening of painful, quiet understanding. My son's smile was the only true light in that house. When he laughed, a crystalline, innocent sound, I felt the perpetual ice in my chest melt for a fleeting moment. We would play on the worn rug with wooden spoons and bottle caps, transforming them into entire armies and magnificent castles. In those moments, I was no longer Dennis's wife, the disgraced and subdued woman. I was Thomas's mom, and that, for the time being, was enough for me to survive. One evening, as I was nursing him, Dennis returned from his work. He paused in the doorway and watched us. "You're spoiling him," he said, with his usual grace. "Women spoil boys and make them weak. He needs to learn how to stand alone, how to be tough." I didn't answer, but I held Thomas a little tighter, an instinctive, fierce gesture of protection. My silent battle had just begun. 3 years later, Janet arrived. Her pregnancy was completely different. There was no longer the blinding terror of the first time, but a new, fiercely determined awareness. When the midwife told me it was a girl, I felt a powerful, ambivalent emotion, immense joy, and a deep, gnawing fear. Joy, because I would have a companion, a feminine soul to whom I could pass on something different from what I had received. Fear, because I knew exactly what it meant to be born a woman in that world, a creature whose value was measured by her silence and her obedience. I swore to myself, holding her in my arms for the first time, that I would give her the tools to defend herself. Not just love, but also strength, self-awareness, a voice. I named her Janet. With 2 children, the small house filled up with life, a chaotic, noisy, exhausting, but wonderfully, desperately real life. Thomas was a thoughtful, quiet boy, much like me, with a gentle soul and a sharp intelligence that he tried to hide so as not to draw his father's critical eye. Janet, on the other hand, was the opposite, a small hurricane of energy, intensely curious, stubbornly persistent, and always ready to challenge the unspoken rules of our house. They were my sun and my moon, and they brilliantly illuminated my darkness. But their growth also made the cold bars of my cage more apparent and much more painful. I desperately wanted to offer them more. A new dress that wasn't patched up from scraps, a better toy than a piece of wood, an extra sweet treat. But the money Dennis gave me counted and recounted, was barely enough for bread and dry beans. It was then, from the arid ground of my deep frustration, that the first true secret root of my rebellion began to sprout. I had always possessed a certain natural skill for embroidery. It was one of the few quiet, feminine things I had been allowed to learn as a girl. In the long, silent evenings, after the children were asleep and Dennis was out at the tavern playing poker, I took up a needle and thread again. I no longer stitched the usual monograms onto linens. I created. I drew with the thread, tiny wildflowers, small birds, delicate butterflies. I embroidered on scraps of old cloth, remnants I managed to recover from the local fabric store's discarded waste bin. It was my way of imposing a small piece of beauty onto the grayness, of creating a small, orderly, colorful world that obeyed only me. One day, the school principal's wife, a kind woman who sometimes showed me a quiet, tacit compassion, came to the house on a flimsy pretense. She saw one of my small embroideries lying casually on a chair. "Donna, did you do this? It's absolutely beautiful," she said, her voice genuinely surprised. I felt my cheeks flush hot. "It's just a pastime," I mumbled quickly. "A pastime? This is the work of an artist. My cousin owns a small children's boutique in the city downtown. Things like this would sell in an instant." She looked at me intently, and in that look I saw an offer, a door quietly left ajar. "If you were to make more, I could take them to her next time I visit. No pressure, just to see what happens." My heart instantly leaped into my throat, a beat of terror and hope so powerful it physically hurt me. The idea was both terrifying and intensely exhilarating. To have money that was truly mine, money that Dennis knew absolutely nothing about. It was an act of pure distilled rebellion. If he ever discovered it, I didn't dare imagine the depth of his fury. But then I looked at my children playing quietly on the floor. I thought of a future where I might be able to buy them a new book or proper new shoes without having to beg and grovel for a week. "Maybe," I replied, my voice a whisper, but firm. "Maybe I could try." That was the silent birth of my second life. By day, I was Dennis's quiet, submissive wife. By night, in the dim, weak light of an oil lamp, I became a creator. I embroidered with a feverish intensity, a passion I had never known. Every single stitch was a small, defiant act. Every flower that bloomed under my needle was a piece of freedom I was quietly claiming for myself. The principal's wife became my devoted accomplice. Once a month, she would stop by the house, and I would secretly hand her my completed pieces. And the following week, she would return with a few dollars, which I would quickly hide in a small, loose hole behind a brick in the fireplace hearth. They were pitifully small sums of money. But to me, they were an invaluable, priceless treasure. They were the tangible proof that my hands could create not just clean laundry and hot food, but also beauty and value. They were my secret, my root that was slowly growing in the darkness, nourished by hope and the terrifying thrill of risk. Meanwhile, the children were growing up and beginning to understand the undercurrents of the house. They absorbed the constant tension like small, sensitive sponges. One day, Thomas, who was perhaps 6 years old, asked me, "Mom, why doesn't Dad ever smile when he plays with me?" I didn't know what honest answer to give him. The real shock came shortly after. Janet, who was always the bolder, more spirited one, accidentally knocked over a glass of iced tea at the dinner table. A simple, trivial accident. Dennis instantly shot up, his face a mask of terrifying, cold rage. "Watch what you're doing, you clumsy girl," he roared at her, with a violence in his voice that instantly froze my blood. I saw my daughter flinch violently, her eyes quickly filling with tears and confusion. In her, for one terrifying, blinding moment, I saw my own younger self standing before my father's quiet rage. Before I could even consciously think, I stood up and placed myself physically between him and the little girl. "She is just a child, Dennis. It was an accident," I said. My voice was calm, but as steady and firm as steel. He glared at me, surprised by my sudden, unprecedented insolence. "Don't interfere. Children are educated with discipline, not with your soft coddling, or they'll grow up to be weak and useless just like you are." His words cut me deeply, as they always did. But this time, the wound instantly turned into a cold, sharp, and intensely clear rage. I understood in that precise moment that my continued submission was not protecting my children. On the contrary, it was exposing them to the exact same toxic atmosphere in which I myself had been forced to live. My silence was giving Dennis the unspoken permission to be cruel to them too. And this, I could not. I would not allow any longer. That evening, after I had tucked the children into bed and told them a whispered story, I went straight to the fireplace. Dennis was out. With hands that only trembled slightly, I moved the loose brick and pulled out my small, priceless treasure, the cloth bundle that held the savings from almost 2 years of secretive night work. I counted them out. It was still only a small, inadequate amount of money. It wasn't enough to go very far. But as I held those few bills in my hand, I no longer felt only the faint, passive desire to buy my children a few new dresses or toys. I felt a much bigger idea being born, an idea that was more terrifying and infinitely more powerful than anything I had ever dared to formulate. The idea that, one day, this money would not be used to buy things. It would be used to buy the most precious thing of all, our freedom. That idea was still a seed, small and terribly fragile, much like the life I had first felt moving within me so many years before. But now, finally, it had been consciously planted. And I knew that I would spend every day, every hour, every minute of my life secretly nurturing it, watering it with my endless patience and my unwavering determination, just waiting for the exact, perfect moment. The moment when that small, secret root would grow strong enough to shatter the stone of my prison. The quiet determination that took root in me after Janet's birth was not a passionate, loud fire. It was a cold, slow-burning ember. It was fueled by the absolute necessity of protecting my children from the oppressive moral tyranny that had already consumed my own life. My fear of Dennis remained, a constant, low-frequency hum, but it was now dwarfed by a larger, more powerful engine, the ferocious, protective love of a mother. I had traded the luxury of despair for the grim, hard work of hope. The subsequent years passed with deceptive slowness. On the surface, our existence was trapped in an unchanging, endless routine. Days blended into weeks, waking before dawn, preparing meals, cleaning the small house, tending to the children, waiting for Dennis's return from the carpentry shop, eating dinner in a silence as heavy as concrete, and finally falling into an exhausted, restless sleep. But beneath that stagnant surface, my secret roots were growing, tenacious and invisible. My small treasury, hidden behind the brick in the hearth, slowly, agonizingly grew, dollar by dollar, stitch by painstaking stitch. It was an agonizingly slow process, frustrating in its sluggishness, but every single bill I added was an infinitesimal step toward a distant horizon that only I could clearly see. My children were the only true light in my life. Thomas had become a tall, quiet boy with a gentle soul and a sharp, hungry intelligence he consciously tried to keep hidden so as not to attract his father's relentless criticisms. He devoured the few books I could secretly manage to provide, and in his serious eyes, I saw the same aching hunger for a bigger world that had once been my own. Janet, on the other hand, had blossomed into a girl bursting with life, with a fierce spark of open rebellion in her gaze that filled me with equal measures of pride and raw terror. She was beautiful, but not with a quiet, reassuring Southern charm. Hers was a proud, defiant beauty that challenged the unwritten rules of our small town. She was everything I had not been allowed to be, and her very existence was a constant, daily challenge to the suffocating order of our home. Dennis, as he aged, did not mellow. On the contrary, his bitterness and resentment festered. His control over me had slightly loosened, not out of kindness, but out of dull habit and sheer disinterest. However, his obsessive attention had now shifted entirely to the children, especially to Janet. He monitored her with a terrifying paranoid intensity, seeing in every innocent laugh, every word exchanged with a peer, the inevitable shadow of the dishonor that he believed was an inherited flaw in my bloodline. I navigated this constant minefield with maximum caution, desperately trying to protect them, to act as a buffer between their youthful exuberance and his simmering tyranny. But I knew, deep down, that the time was rapidly running out. My small, invisible bubble of protection could not shield them forever. The breaking point arrived, as it perhaps inevitably had to, during the annual Founders' Day festival. The very same celebration that, almost 2 decades earlier, had marked the catastrophic end of my own childhood. Janet, who was now 16 years old, the exact age I had been that devastating night, had been permitted to attend, but only under the strict, watchful supervision of me and her brother. She was intensely excited, radiantly happy. She wore a simple dress I had painstakingly sewn for her, and her sheer, contagious joy almost made me forget the deep, acidic hatred I harbored for that entire event. We were standing in the town square, surrounded by the crowds and the loud, cheerful music. Janet was talking and laughing with a group of her girlfriends. At one point, a young man, the local mechanic's son, an earnest and rather shy boy, approached their group. He exchanged a few polite words with Janet, smiling innocently. It was a completely innocent, normal scene anywhere else in the world. But not in ours. I instantly saw Dennis's gaze, watching us from his usual spot at the diner's counter, turn hard and glacial. I watched him stand up and walk toward us, his heavy stride announcing a terrifying storm. He stopped right behind Janet. He did not say a word to her. He addressed the young man directly. "What do you want with my daughter?" he hissed, his voice so loaded with icy menace that the poor boy instantly turned white. "Nothing, Mr. Dennis. We were just talking about the school dance." The boy stammered, terrified. "You have nothing to talk about with her. Get out of here now, before I decide to break your legs," Dennis snarled. The terrified boy instantly fled into the thick crowd. Then Dennis grabbed Janet violently by the arm, right there in front of everyone. "And you, home." "Now," he ordered her, his voice choked with raw rage. "But Daddy, I didn't do anything wrong," Janet protested, tears instantly welling up in her eyes from the public humiliation. "You have done enough. You have dishonored my name, laughing like a brazen hussy right in the middle of the square." "Home!" He dragged her away, completely ignoring her tearful protests, utterly uncaring of the stares of the crowd, a mix of morbid curiosity and, sickeningly, approval for a father who knew how to keep his daughter in line. Thomas and I followed them, feeling helpless, our hearts reduced to a tight, frozen fist. In that single violent gesture, in that raw public humiliation, in those baseless accusations, I saw more than just the crushing injustice toward my daughter. I saw my own devastating past repeating itself with a monstrous, horrifying precision. I saw the vicious circle closing in, and I knew, with cold, absolute certainty, that if I didn't act immediately, that circle would crush her too, just as it had mercilessly crushed me. That night, after a terrible scene during which Dennis raged at Janet, forbidding her from leaving the house for an entire month, I found my daughter crying silently in her bed. I sat down beside her and gently stroked her hair. "It's not fair, Mom," she sobbed, clutching my hand. "I didn't do anything wrong. Why does he hate me so much?" "He doesn't hate you, my love," I said, my voice trembling with an old, cold rage. He is only afraid, and his fear is what makes him cruel. But as I spoke the words, I understood they were no longer enough. Words were useless now. The period of quiet waiting was finally over. The time for patience, for endurance, for silent sacrifice had expired. My secret root had become strong enough. It was time to shatter the stone. The next morning, I made a decision I never thought I would possess the strength to carry out. I told Dennis I was going to visit an ailing relative, an elderly cousin in a neighboring town, a lie he accepted with a careless shrug. I left the house, but I didn't take the road toward the bus depot. I took the old, familiar path that led to the house where I was born, the house where my mother, Barbara, still lived. My father, Robert, had passed away a few years prior. My mother remained alone in that small stone house, a fragile older widow who rarely ventured out. I didn't visit her often. Our rare visits were always painfully short, intensely awkward, filled with strained silences and decades of unspoken truths. But this morning, I had things to say. I had a question that had been burning a raw hole in my soul for 20 long years. As I walked through the streets of my painful past, every corner seemed to speak to me. There was the town square where I had been humiliated. There was the alleyway, the one that led to the overgrown lot, which I still avoided like the plague. I could feel my heart pounding heavily in my chest. When I reached the front door of my childhood home, I paused, hesitating. A terrified part of me wanted to turn back, to return to my familiar silence, my well-known prison. But then I saw my daughter's tear-stained face in my mind, and I knocked. It was my mother who opened the door. She was more stooped, more fragile than I remembered. Her movements were slow, uncertain. She looked at me in genuine surprise. "Donna, what are you doing here?" "I just came to see you, Mom," I said, stepping into the house that smelled faintly of dust and forgotten memories. The kitchen was exactly the same heavy wooden table, the same old cupboard, the same cold fireplace. We sat down across from one another, just as we had that night so many years ago when my father had coldly pronounced my sentence. For a while we talked about the weather, about her health, about the banalities that only served to fill the immense void between us. Then I took a deep, steadying breath. "Mom," I began, and my voice was finally steady. "Last night, Dennis humiliated Janet in the square. He dragged her home by the arm because she was talking to a boy. He told her she had dishonored his name." My mother dropped her gaze to her hands, which were tightly clasped on the table. "Your husband is a very strict man," she murmured quietly. "He only wants to protect her reputation." "No," I said, and this time my voice did not crack. "That isn't protection. It is the exact same cage they put me in. And you were there. And you did absolutely nothing." The silence in the room became heavy, absolute. She did not raise her eyes. "For 20 years, I continued, and I felt the words pour out, a raging river finally breaking its dams. "For 20 years, every single night, I have asked myself the same question. You were my mother. You gave birth to me. That night, when I came home, I didn't need a judge. I needed you. And you turned your back. You told me to be silent. You watched me die inside and only worried about not making any noise." The tears streamed down my face, but they were no longer tears of weakness. They were the cleansing tears of an ancient rage that had finally found its voice. "Today I ask you this, Mom. Look me in the eyes and tell me, why? Why did you abandon me?" She finally raised her head. And what I saw completely stunned me. I did not see a monster. I did not see a judge. I saw an old, terrified woman, her eyes full of a pain so vast and deep that I almost felt myself drowning in it. Her lips trembled, and then she began to speak. Her voice was a bare whisper, the sound of something irreparably breaking. "Your father," she began, her voice raw. "Your father was the law. His word was like a commandment from God. I was terrified, Donna, a terrible, paralyzing fear. Not for me, for you. I thought that if you spoke, if you accused Dennis publicly, your father would have thrown you out of the house immediately. You would have become a permanent outcast, an untouchable, and no one would ever have wanted you. You would have ended up on the street. I thought, in my utterly terrified mind, I thought that the marriage was the only, terrible, viable solution to save you, to give you a roof, a place, some stability in the world." I shook my head slowly. That wasn't a place. It was a grave. "I know," she whispered, and a deep, wrenching sob shook her frail body. I understood that later. Every single day of my life after I watched you walk away with him, I understood. But by then, it was too late. I was a coward, Donna. My entire life was one long, agonizing lesson in fear. I was afraid of my father, then I was afraid of your husband. I never, ever had a voice of my own, and when you needed mine the most, I couldn't find it. She confessed everything, in a torrent of whispered words broken by sharp, painful sobs. She confessed her life of utter submission, her own small, crushed dreams, her paralyzing impotence. She confessed that my pain had been her own secret torment, a crushing guilt that had consumed her from the inside for decades. "Every night," she said, her eyes lost and vacant. "Every night I pray to God to forgive me for what I allowed to happen to you. But I know He won't forgive me. And I don't deserve it." I listened intently, and as I listened, I felt something profound shifting within me. The furious, sustaining anger that had propped me up for 20 years slowly began to subside, to dissipate. In its place, I did not find forgiveness. Not yet. But I found something else. A cold, immense, deeply desolate pity. Pity for that old woman, destroyed by remorse. Pity for the young woman she had been, herself a victim of the very same system that had sacrificed me. I understood that I could not get justice from her. Justice for me was no longer her confession or her desperate repentance. Justice was breaking the chain. I stood up. She looked up at me, her eyes brimming with tears, as if expecting a final word, a devastating verdict. But I had nothing left to say to her. I placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, a gesture that was not one of affection, but simply of final farewell. Then I turned and walked out of that house for the very last time. As I walked back toward my prison, the air felt strangely different, lighter. The crushing weight I had carried for 20 years, the weight of her betrayal, had vanished. Not because I had forgiven her, but because I had understood. And understanding sometimes is the only thing we need to finally be able to move forward. I no longer felt rage. I no longer felt acute pain. I felt only a glacial, razor-sharp calm, a lucidity I had never experienced before. My objective had become crystalline, clear, pure, and simple. Arriving back at the house, I walked straight to the fireplace. I moved the loose brick and pulled out my hidden treasure. I clenched the wad of bills tightly in my fist. It was no longer a distant, comforting dream. It was a plan, a meticulous plan that would be executed very, very soon. As I felt the cold paper of the money against my skin, a single phrase formed in my mind, not as a thought, but as a silent, unshakable oath. Enough. This is enough. We are leaving. The glacial calm that had settled over me after the meeting with my mother was not a feeling of peace. It was the sharp, honed lucidity of a soldier before a crucial battle. The time for doubt, for tears, for crippling fear was definitively over. Now was the time for relentless action. My escape plan, an idea long nurtured and secretly caressed in the darkness of my solitude, transformed instantly into a detailed, feverish map inside my mind. Every single day, as I went about my usual monotonous chores, my mind worked incessantly, calculating risks, studying Dennis's predictable habits, and preparing every single move. My life became completely dual. On the surface, I was the same old Donna, the submissive wife, the attentive mother. But deep inside, I had become a meticulous strategist, a spy in my own home, and my every action was singularly focused on one enormous, overwhelming purpose: the Great Escape. The first critical step was the money. My small, hidden treasure was the fruit of years of secret work, but I knew it wouldn't last for long once we were on our own. I had to make one final, intense effort. My nights grew longer. After the house finally sank into a deep, predictable sleep, I would sit at the kitchen table, illuminated by the tiny, weak glow of a single candle to avoid detection, and I would embroider. My fingers flew, tireless, guided by a frantic energy that was a desperate mixture of hope and sheer exhaustion. I was no longer merely creating small flowers. I was producing, with a speed I didn't know I was capable of. My hands ached, my back was a constant, searing pain, but I could not stop. Every finished piece was one more small, tangible step toward my freedom. I made one final large delivery to the principal's wife. I went to her house on the pretense of running an errand, bringing her a heavy basket full of my work, nearly a month's worth of frantic stitching. She instantly knew something was gravely different. "Donna, you haven't overtaxed yourself, have you?" she asked me quietly, noticing the dark, heavy shadows beneath my eyes. "I need this money, please," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Every single penny you can get. It's absolutely vital." In her gaze, there was no rude curiosity, but only a deep, profound, and silent understanding. She nodded slowly. "I will do my very best. Come back in 1 week." That week was pure agony. Then finally, I went to collect my last payment. She placed a heavier than usual envelope in my hand. "My cousin sold everything. She says your pieces bring a kind of necessary cheerfulness," she said, and squeezed my hand tightly. In that simple gesture, I felt all her quiet support, her silent, protective complicity. That woman, without ever asking a single question, had been my one and only true ally through all those dark years. That night, I performed the final, definitive count. I emptied my secret hiding place and spread all the bills and the few coins on the table. I counted them again and again. The sum was laughably small by the world's standards, but for me, it was a priceless fortune. It was the down payment on our lives. The next stage was logistics. How were we going to get out of the town? The train station was too far away and too heavily monitored. The only viable path was the early morning regional bus, the one that passed on the main highway before dawn, typically used by migrant workers heading to the large general market in the state capital. Under the flimsy excuse of needing to buy a special thread for my latest embroidery, I convinced Thomas to accompany me on a long walk right up to the main highway, just to look at the cars. While he watched the distant traffic with youthful curiosity, I meticulously memorized the exact location of the stop: a simple, weathered wooden post with a rusty sign. I read the faded schedule. There was one run at 5 o'clock in the morning. That would be it. The most difficult and most delicate step was preparing my children. I couldn't just wake them up in terror and drag them away. I had to secure their absolute trust and, above all, their complete silence. One evening, while Janet was already asleep, I pulled Thomas, who was now nearly 16, aside. We sat outside on the front steps of the house, pretending to take in the cool evening air. "Thomas," I began, my heart hammering violently in my chest. "Do you remember the stories I used to tell you when you were little? The ones about traveling to far-off places?" He nodded slowly, looking at me with his serious, alert eyes. Soon, I continued, choosing every word with the utmost care. You, Janet, and I are going on a trip, a very long journey. We are going to leave this place, to start a new life, in a place where you can read all the books you want, and where your sister can laugh without anyone shouting at her. His eyes widened slightly. What about Dad? He asked in a hesitant whisper. That was the question I had most dreaded. Dad is not coming with us, my love. This is a journey just for the three of us. I saw the confusion and a quick flash of fear in his gaze. This is going to be our secret, I quickly added, taking his hands firmly in mine. The most important secret of our lives. You must not say a single word of it to anyone, not even to Janet, until I tell you it's time. You have to be strong for her, and you have to trust me completely. Can you do that for me, son? Thomas looked at me for a long, silent moment. He was just a teenager, but in that moment, I saw the solemn wisdom of a man. I saw that he understood, perhaps not all the painful details, but the essential truth. He understood the profound sadness, the fear, and the desperate hope. And he nodded. Yes, Mom, I trust you. In that moment, I knew I was no longer fighting this battle alone. I had a powerful, quiet ally. The final act of preparation was the most tense. I had to hide the money securely. I decided to sew the cash into the inner linings of the children's winter coats. I waited for a night when I was absolutely certain Dennis was deeply asleep, drunk after a long, noisy evening at the tavern. I carefully brought out my needle, thread, and my entire treasure. With trembling hands, I delicately unstitched a small section of the lining in each coat and began to insert the bills, flattening them out completely. Every stitch I took was a silent prayer. My heart leaped into my throat with every creak of the old house, with every outside noise. Halfway through sewing Janet's coat, I heard a harsh cough from the master bedroom. I froze, completely petrified, my breath painfully suspended. I heard the old bed springs creak, as if Dennis was turning over. For a minute that felt like an eternity, I remained motionless in the darkness, convinced he would get up and find me. But then, the heavy, deep snoring returned. I resumed my sewing, my fingers numb from the tension, and finally finished. The coats looked completely normal, innocent, but inside they carried the sheer, enormous weight of our future freedom. The following days were an agonizing wait. I was looking for the perfect night. A moonless night, a night when Dennis was particularly exhausted or particularly drunk. The tension was almost unbearable. Dennis, as if sensing a fundamental shift in the atmosphere, had become more irritable and subtly suspicious than usual. One afternoon, he found me carefully folding the children's coats to place them at the very bottom of a deep storage chest. "What are you doing?" he demanded, with his usual harsh tone. "It's not winter yet, woman." They felt damp, I quickly fabricated, trying to keep my voice steady. I put them out in the sun for a bit, and now I'm putting them away before they collect dust. He looked at me with narrow-eyed suspicion. He walked closer, picked up Thomas's coat, and weighed it in his hand. I felt my blood turn to ice in my veins. Could he feel the rustle of the bills? Could he possibly notice the minuscule extra weight? He stood there for a second, holding the coat, then, with a grunt, he threw it back carelessly into the chest. "Women's nonsense," he muttered, and walked out. I leaned against the wall, my legs trembling so violently I thought I would collapse. We had come within an inch of total disaster. That night, I made my final decision. Tonight was the night. The evening passed in a dizzying fog of terror and iron-willed determination. I put the children to bed, giving them both an unusually long kiss. "We're getting up early for a game tomorrow," I whispered into Janet's ear. "But you have to be absolutely silent, like a little mouse." A single look was enough for Thomas. He understood. I lay down beside Dennis. I pretended to be asleep, but every nerve in my body was tight and screaming. I listened to his breathing, which slowly grew heavier until it settled into the deep, familiar snore I knew so well. But that wasn't enough. I waited for 2 more hours. I listened to the sounds of the night, the cry of a distant animal, the wind rustling the eaves. Every sound made me flinch. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. It was time. I got out of the bed with agonizing slowness, every movement calculated to avoid creaking the old floorboards. I went to the children's room. I woke them with the lightest touch. They were confused, sleepy, but my determined gaze and my finger pressed to my lips made them obey in complete silence. I dressed them in the dark, fitting them into the heavy coats laden with hope. I took the one small, essential bag I had prepared, containing a loaf of bread, a bottle of water, and 1 change of clothes each. We were ready. The last, terrifying obstacle was getting out of the house. We crept toward the front door on tiptoe. Turning the key in the lock produced a sound that, in the dead silence of the night, seemed as loud as a cannon blast. I held my breath, listening intently. From the bedroom, only Dennis's continuous, heavy snoring. I opened the door slowly, 1 millimeter at a time. The cold night air hit us with a sudden rush. We slipped out, one after the other. I closed the door softly behind me, without turning the key back. It was a final, symbolic gesture. I left that door open, as if to symbolically leave my prison unlocked, but with no intention whatsoever of ever returning. The walk through the town was the most frightening moment of my life. Every shadow seemed like an enemy waiting in ambush. The distant bark of a dog nearly made our hearts leap out of our chests. I held the children's hands, gripping them fiercely. We walked close to the walls, enveloped in the deepest darkness. The town square, the site of my first humiliation and my daughter's most recent one, was deserted, utterly spectral. We passed the church, the diner, the houses of our neighbors, all soundly asleep, completely unaware of our silent, desperate exodus. Finally, we reached the main highway. The bus stop was there, a solitary pole in the immensity of the dark countryside. We sat down on a large stone, hidden behind a thick bush. The wait was another form of torture. The cold seeped deep into our bones. Every light of a distant vehicle that appeared was a fresh wave of panic. What if it was someone from town? What if they recognized us? But they were only solitary trucks, roaring past without slowing. The sky slowly began to lighten in the east, transitioning from black to a deep, bruised blue. Time was running out, and then we saw it. A tiny point of light, then 2, slowly approaching. It was the bus. When it finally pulled up in front of us, its doors opening with a loud hiss, it sounded like the most beautiful, liberating music in the entire world. The sleepy driver barely looked at us. I paid the fares with the handful of coins I had kept separate in my pocket. We hurried toward the back, sinking into the worn seats. We were the only passengers. The bus remained still for a minute that felt like an eternity. I stared out the window, back toward the road leading to the town, expecting at any second to see a figure running toward us, to hear my name yelled. But nothing happened. Then, with a shudder, the engine roared louder. The doors hissed shut with a definitive click. And the bus began to move, slowly at first, then picking up speed, carrying us away, north, toward the unknown. I looked at my children's faces, pale in the uncertain light of the false dawn. And out the window, I watched the last house of my old town disappear behind a gentle curve. I didn't feel joy, not yet. Only a sharp vertigo, an immense, raw terror, and beneath it all, a fragile, incandescent, impossible hope. The longest night was finally over. And for the very first time, I didn't know what the new day would bring. And that, in itself, was a powerful, wonderful feeling. The bus that carried us away from our painful past was an old, rattling beast that seemed to gasp with every slow climb. With every mile it devoured, I felt a knot in my stomach loosen just a little more. My children, utterly exhausted from the tension and the long, cold vigil, fell asleep almost immediately, their heads resting against each other. I, however, could not close my eyes. I remained with my forehead pressed against the cold window glass, watching the world outside relentlessly change. I watched my native land, the South, transform under the rising sun. The dry, sun-drenched hills, the gnarled oak trees, the small stone towns clinging to the landscape like wasp nests. And as the sun rose higher, that land which had been my entire life seemed increasingly foreign, increasingly small. We were ants fleeing a destroyed colony. The fear was still there, a tight, coiled animal in my chest, but for the first time it was surpassed by something else, the dizzying sense of the unknown, which felt almost like a tangible form of hope. The journey lasted 2 exhausting days, 2 days of stale bread, of curious sidelong glances from the few other passengers, of thick, strained silences between Thomas and me. We crossed into the northern states, and the landscape changed again. The hills became greener, the towns more orderly, the sky a paler, less oppressive blue. And finally, we arrived in Detroit, Michigan. The bus depot was a monster of iron, smoke, and noise. A chaos of people rushing in every possible direction, of voices I couldn't understand, of acrid smells of diesel, and of the indifferent city. For a terrifying second, raw panic overwhelmed me. I was an unschooled Southern girl, with 2 dependent children and barely enough money to last a week, dropped into the heart of a massive, cold, and indifferent city. What in God's name did I think I was doing? I gripped my children's hands tighter than ever. Their warmth was my only absolute anchor. "Let's go," I said, more to steady myself than to instruct them, and we plunged into the crushing crowd that threatened to instantly swallow us whole. The early days were the hardest of my entire life, harder than Dennis's tyranny, harder than the quiet hunger of my youth. I managed to find a single cramped room in a damp, cold attic in a poor, crowded neighborhood where other internal migrants like us lived. Our only meager luxury was a tiny window that looked out onto a gray, rubbish-strewn courtyard. The small amount of cash I had brought with me vanished quickly, consumed by the exorbitant rent and the bare minimum of food. Every single day, I would leave the children in that tiny room and head out into the hostile streets to search for work. And every day, I returned with empty hands and a heavier soul. "We don't need your kind of help up here," I was told. "You can't read or write the paperwork." Doors were coldly slammed in my face. My origin, my thick Southern accent, were a constant, visible mark of inferiority. The humiliation was my daily bread. Sometimes, in the evenings, after the children had finally fallen asleep, I would curl up under the thin blankets and cry silent, bitter tears, assailed by the terrifying doubt that I had made a devastating mistake, that I had violently dragged them from a secure, if painful prison, only to bring them to starve in a cruel, hostile freedom. But then I would look at their serene, sleeping faces, and I knew I would not give up. Despair was a crippling luxury I could no longer afford to indulge in. The breakthrough came in the form of a job no one else wanted. I became a laundress. I worked for a huge industrial laundry that serviced the downtown luxury hotels. It was backbreaking, ceaseless labor. I spent 10, sometimes 12 hours a day with my hands plunged into scalding water and harsh lye, scrubbing massively heavy sheets and tablecloths until my hands were raw. In the evenings, I would return to our tiny room with a broken back and hands that were red, swollen, and so cracked I could barely close them. But for the first time, at the end of the week, a timekeeper would place a small envelope in my hand that contained my own wages, my money, earned by my sweat. No one could control it. No one could hold it over my head. That day, on my way back to our room, I stopped at a bakery and bought 3 small, cream-filled pastries. When my children saw them, their eyes lit up with brilliant, pure joy. That evening, in our cold attic room, we ate those small treats as if it were a king's banquet. And for the very first time since leaving home, we laughed. We laughed hard, all 3 of us together. In that moment, I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that we would make it. Slowly, painfully, brick by brick, I began to rebuild our lives. The children started school. It was hard for them at first, constantly teased for their accent. But they were resilient. Thomas plunged into his books with a fierce, consuming passion. He mastered reading and writing in months, quickly surpassing my own meager education. Janet, with her steel-edged spirit, learned to stand up to the bullies, earning the respect of her new peers. And in the evenings after my work, I learned from them. They became my devoted teachers, teaching me the alphabet, the words, the grammar. And I, in turn, pulled out my old secret talent. In my scarce free time, I began to embroider again, no longer secretly, no longer with constant fear. I stitched by the light of our single overhead bulb, and my creations were different now. They were bolder, more intensely colorful. They were filled with the resilience and the quiet hope of our new, hard-won life. One day, gathering all my courage, I showed my pieces to the kind owner of a small notion shop near our apartment. An elderly, gentle man. He examined my embroideries for a long time and then looked up at me. "Ma'am, this isn't just thread. This is art. I'll keep them here in the store. Let's just see what happens." What happened was that my embroideries were a hit. First, a neighbor bought one, then another. Word quietly spread. The embroidered pieces by the Southern lady, as they were known, became highly requested. Initially, it was just a few dollars, an insignificant supplement to my meager laundress wage. But then the orders steadily increased. After a brutal, determined year, I was able to leave the laundry. I converted a corner of our small room into my first true workshop. My children helped me. Thomas, with the careful accounts, Janet with the vibrant colors. We were no longer just survivors. We were a small business, a family building its own future, one stitch at a time. The years passed with a new, comforting rhythm. The attic room eventually gave way to a small, respectable apartment with 2 bedrooms and a tiny balcony where I managed to grow a pot of basil and some bright geraniums. My small business grew into a proper, respected shop, a little gem known throughout the neighborhood. My children grew up healthy, strong, and free. Thomas, my quiet, brilliant boy, won a full scholarship and entered the local university, the first person in our entire family history to cross that profound threshold. He graduated at the top of his class in engineering. Janet, my spirited, golden-hearted rebel, became a compassionate, tenacious nurse, a woman who wasn't afraid to speak her mind and fiercely fight for others. They both married well, and they gave me wonderful grandchildren, who now run and laugh loudly in this very house that I eventually bought with the fruits of my own hands. A house with a sunny backyard, here in the north, where I even managed to plant a tiny jasmine vine. For years, I completely closed the door on the past. It was sealed, locked away. Then, one day, about 10 years ago, I received a letter. It was from the daughter of the principal's wife, my old accomplice. She wrote to tell me that her mother had passed away and that she had been made to promise that she would write to me one day. She recounted what had happened back in our town after our shocking flight. There had been a massive scandal, of course, at first. Dennis, publicly humiliated, never once tried to find us. His crushing pride was stronger than his sense of ownership. He lived the remainder of his life as a lonely, dark, and deeply embittered man, feared by everyone but genuinely loved by no one. He had died the year before, from a severe lung ailment, alone. My mother, Barbara, had passed away a few years after we left, consumed, the letter suggested, by a silent, consuming sadness. I read that letter right here, sitting on my porch swing, and to my utter surprise, I felt neither crude joy nor lingering hatred. I felt no sense of triumph over Dennis's miserable end, only a vast, heavy, tired pity. And for my mother, I felt a deep sadness, the sadness for a life utterly wasted by fear. Had I forgiven them? I don't know that I ever truly did. But they no longer held any kind of power over me. They had become the faded ghosts of a long-ago story, the story of another woman, a girl who simply no longer existed. Today, I am 78 years old. Sometimes, when I am out here in my garden and the breeze rustles the leaves of my jasmine vine, I catch that familiar, heavy scent. But it no longer hurts me. It is no longer the smell of a devastating ending. It is simply the smell of a memory, the memory of how incredibly far I have traveled. I look at my hands now, old and gnarled, and I see the hands of a laundress, of an embroiderer, of a mother, of a grandmother. They are the hands of a woman who fell into the deepest darkness and who found the profound strength to climb back out, stitch by painstaking stitch, step by determined step. My greatest legacy is not this shop or this comfortable house. It is my children and my children's children, a generation that does not know the kind of fear I lived under, a generation that does not know what it means to be forced into silence. I broke the chain. And finally, after an entire life lived under the shadow of others, I learned to pronounce my own name, Donna, not as the daughter of Robert or the wife of Dennis, but simply as mine, alone and unequivocally mine. Thank you for listening to me today, for allowing me to share with you this intimate chapter of my life. If my story has touched you, please don't hesitate to leave a like on this video and subscribe to this channel to discover other testimonies like mine. And please share it, because who knows, maybe someone going through a similar trial right now will find the courage to keep searching, to hope, to believe in the impossible. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from today? Thank you from the bottom of my heart for listening to me.